Hello. My name's Rob Williams, and I'd just like to say before we start that I'm really honoured to be able to speak to you today. Although in the time of COVID, we have to resort to this virtual means of communication. But I hope nonetheless that this talk is going to be useful and interesting to you. Just to introduce myself a little, I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Westminster in London, where I run a Master's in International Liaison Communication. And I also teach on the MA in TESOL, and I run modules in intercultural communication and in current developments in language teaching. I suppose really it's the last of these things that brings me to talk to you today. So I've called this presentation New Models of Teaching and Their Relationship with Technology. And I've put new in inverted commas quite deliberately because I feel that there is a kind of a question to be asked about whether the advent of technology has created new models of teaching or whether it's simply an addition of what we can already do in the classroom. So I suppose we should better start with the classroom, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this kind of scenario. It's a fairly typical classroom with students in rows waiting for a teacher. The teacher will probably come in at some time and spend most of the class time talking. Students will probably write things down. They may occasionally ask questions. They may be given homework, exercises to consolidate what they are supposed to have learned in class. And at the end of the term or periodically, they might be tested about what they know. And I think this is a fairly typical scenario that we're all quite used to seeing. And we can call this the traditional classroom. And in this kind of model, instruction is what takes place in the classroom, and the homework is given over to consolidation. And there is a reason for this. In the school, the conditions for learning are controlled. The teacher can be sure that the same input is given to the students at the same time, whereas at home, students live in all kinds of spaces with all kinds of other constraints on their lives and on their day. So it sort of makes sense that it's the teacher who controls the input. And it's always been that way, hasn't it? I mean, the notion of the wise person as the guru, the keeper of knowledge, if you like, has now translated into the teacher and the teacher-centered focus of what was called the traditional classroom. And I suppose that, although even with access to books and libraries, although the teacher was no longer the keeper of all knowledge, they were certainly the curator of all knowledge, and most likely because they read more books and they knew all the good ones. And so the teacher could only be in one place at one time, and learners came to the teacher. But what happens if the teacher could be in many places at once? And I'm sure we're aware of the sort of the principle behind this. What if they could be in many places at once at any time of the day or night? So learners don't have to go to the teacher, neither in the classroom nor, let's say, tuning into a TV program. They can make the teacher come to them. And what if there were so many sources of information that the education professional, the teacher, was no longer a keeper or a curator or a guru? The learner could find their own knowledge. So how would it be if the classroom became a space for exploration of the things that students found and a consolidation of that? So I suppose, in a way, it's kind of understandable that the technological advances we've seen has prompted this thinking around the flipped classroom, because nowadays with flipped classroom and with blended learning, we marry asynchronous and synchronous teaching, live sources, online sources, and to achieve what some proponents of this call an optimum learning situation. And we now have situations that cater for those people with busy days who can't devote all their working day to classes, who can't travel to classrooms sometimes miles away. And this is seen as something great, a panacea, a way to spread education, a way to reach those who couldn't be reached before, and a way to practice the digital skills that are so needed in the 21st century. So it's a great thing, isn't it? And so much so that indeed if you Google flipped classroom or if you Google blended learning, you're confronted with pictures like this. There's an engaged teacher giving a live lesson, often surrounded by books to show their intellectual credibility. Or this, a child in rapt attention, dealing with studying at a table with space enough to write. And all this through the latest specification of laptops and crystal clear screens. I mean, in my own situation, I've been teaching online for the last year, and some of my students tell me that they're working from a bed in a room with not enough space for a table, or where they're sharing a space, a table space with 4 others while the family's cooking and watching TV. So it's not always the rosy learning environment that some people would have us believe. And the same constraints of availability of space and of time, as well as background noise, apply just as they did to doing homework in the traditional model. They still apply in the flipped model and the technologically advanced model. So I suppose the question is, do these methods need technology? Or are we simply assuming this because technology is exciting and new, and technology has driven us to think about things, perhaps in a different way? So we then tend to equate technology with the flipped classroom and with blended learning. This is quite a long introduction, and I'm sure that some of this you already know, but this talk really is to respond to 4 questions that were raised by colleagues, some of your colleagues in Cuba, and which Eduardo Garbe kindly forwarded to me, and I'd like to share these with you now. First one is, can flipped teaching only be applied with new technologies? Kind of what we were talking about before. Secondly is, how can teachers assess students with flipped teaching? Then how can flipped teaching be implemented in ESP? So English for specific purposes, and possibly the most important for the Cuban context, which is, given the lack of internet access in Cuba, how much can teachers actually do with blended learning or with flipped classrooms? Something to think about. Now this, so the talk will be basically a personal reflection based on these questions and based on my own experience as a teacher and a teacher trainer, who really I've come quite late into the use of technology. I was kind of forced into it in the last year more than anything else. And also from ranges of experiences from colleagues and from articles and so on that I've read. So it's a personal reflection. And I suppose a place to start would be something basic like this. Now, I'm sure we're all aware of the learning journey that is described by Bloom's taxonomy, and that the whole that original work, if you like, has to be based on a whole scaffolding of previous phases, from perception to recall to understanding, the ability to form patterns and connections and apply these to new situations and so on. So it makes sense in this way that if understanding and remembering are the key blocks upon which everything else is built, then of course the teacher needs to spend time making sure these are in place. After all, how can we apply what we don't remember? So we need to spend time with the foundations. And this is reflected in these kinds of models. I'm sure we're familiar with this. Standard sort of PPP model from communicative language teaching. Teacher presents new content, controls the practice phase. Over here, so they present new content, they control the practice phase. And in the practice phase, the learners absorb and all the new information and ideas from the presentation, and they rehearse their own performance in a kind of controlled manner. And then we finally get to apply this in a sort of production phase down here, which comes towards the end of our lesson. So you could argue that if people follow this model in most classrooms, then we only get through the first 3 levels of Bloom. Indeed, some people say that we only get through 2. And here we have it, as we see. Some have said that there are 2 forces influencing language learning. This could be a behaviorist force that requires, if you like, rote learning and the need for repetition and the need to remember and understand in order to achieve that. That remembering comes from, if you like, a constant repetition of ideas, a constant repetition of form in grammar sentences and so on. And a more constructivist force that where we start applying things, analysing things, evaluating things, and finally getting to the level of creating. Now, some colleagues have called the behaviourist ideas, if you like, what comes in class, sorry, in the bottom part down here, as, if you like, lower order activity, and the constructivist things as higher order. And I have a kind of an issue with that. But the general thinking is that, as we can see from here, is that in the traditional model, we spend most of our time in class doing the two lower order things, and outside class we do the higher order things. And in the flip model, this should be inverted. So we devote class time to the higher order skills. And of course, this is made more attractive because of the technology that we have to play around with it. But let's just remember a couple of things that are sort of key. There are certain principles in the flipped classroom that basically the lower order input, practicing and so on, take place away from the classroom. And application of the input takes place within the classroom. Now, if we hold on to those two things, we can then ask ourselves the question, do we need technology to do that? Excuse me. So what I'm going to do is give you some ideas about what we can do to keep these principles alive and perhaps change the shape of our classrooms without technology or with very little technology. Now, these may be some things that you're already doing, so please forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, but I kind of think it's worth reminding ourselves of these rather than necessarily worrying that because we haven't got access to equipment and to the latest technology that everyone says we need, we can't develop in what we do, and we can't, if you like, replicate flipped classrooms or blended learning, because I think there are ways in which we can approach doing that. So let's look at flipping with no technology to start off with, or what might look like flipping with no technology. If students can't access information outside the classroom because they don't have access to the internet, but we want them to do work outside the classroom, we need to prepare them with this stuff before the classes. So we need to give them materials to work with. So we can do this. We can create information, instruction, activity packs that students can read and react to in their own time. Now, this may look like traditional homework, but it's not, in the sense that the purpose is different. The purpose is not one of consolidation. The purpose is not one necessarily of practicing what they were presented with in the classroom before. The purpose is to discover new things through the stimulus we give them, and to bring these new ideas from the readings to class. But in order for that to happen, it's crucial that there needs to be a task or an activity that's connected to that content and that students engage with in the following class or classes. And the most important thing is that this activity is not a test. It doesn't look like a test. Because if it does look like a test, basically all that is happening is people are being given homework before the class rather than after the class. And this is not the purpose. The purpose is to create a stimulus that people then can build on and apply in the class that follows. A couple of examples. This is one. This is a biography. It happens to be a Crick and Watson, so it could be useful in the context of ESP students who are studying science. And the aim of this is to set up a kind of a quiz activity. So what we do is we give the students the text to read at home to start off with. And then we ask the students to decide on questions they'd like to ask their colleagues the next day. But the trick is that it's not just any questions. They need to think of questions that their colleagues won't know the answer to, that are connected to the text. So once they've done that, and they've prepared that, they then come into class and there's a quiz, and they take it in turns, and in doing this, the students can't refer to the text when they come, so they're not allowed to actually look back at the text. They've only got their questions, and they can only answer from memory. And then the winning team becomes the one who catches the others out the most. So the aim of this is to get the students to rehearse questions, to recall the content of the text, and to be able to answer the questions that they're given. So we followed, haven't we, the kind of the Bloom flipped classroom model, because we can say that doing this thing, the understanding of the text, the remembering of the text, has been done away from the classroom. We can also say that there's been some kind of practice in question forming that's been done away from the classroom. So they've had to think about how to form questions in English and how to take the content and reformulate things into questions that can be answered. And the application of all of this is done through the work they have done in class. So, moving on. Another typical example would be a jigsaw activity, information exchange, that kind of thing. Now, in this model, students receive part of a text, for example, or perhaps, and by that I mean text that you might cut up into different sections, part of a story, different paragraphs, that kind of thing. Or they could receive students from a group are given different texts that's related to a theme, for example, and they read these, they prepare these, and in the following class they come together and they pool their information to produce something from their shared knowledge. It's a fairly straightforward jigsaw information exchange activity. So essentially they have to collaborate and fulfill and do something that they would not be able to do without the knowledge shared by each member of the group. A couple of examples of this might be a story that they would then transfer into a strip cartoon. So at the beginning, each member of the group has a section of a story. They come together, they work out what the sequence of the story is, and then they draw that and possibly create that to turn into a wall poster, that kind of thing. So there's an information transfer element to this as well. Or they could have different texts on climate change, for example, or a theme that's relevant to your particular class, and they could pool that information and create a poster that has to contain information from all three texts. Now these are very similar to a jigsaw activity that you might run in a classroom anyway, so the mechanics of this is not different. But the benefit of doing it in a kind of a flipped manner is that the reading time is taken out of the classroom, so you're not wandering around a classroom while people are silently reading. And it's being replaced by the time they have to apply what they've absorbed in the reading prior to the classroom. It also means when you start working with, say, B1 students or high A2 B1 students, that you're running an activity which in class time could take a whole class, could take an hour, could take 2 hours or longer. But by doing this across two spaces, so the space outside the classroom and the space in the classroom, more time is spent on the one activity than we could reasonably manage in, let's say, a class that is timetabled for an hour. Added to that, the notion of homework could be seen as more motivating. So rather than being a consolidation activity, this is, if you like, a stimulus towards a tangible goal rather than a repetition of, let's say, drills and grammar exercises. This is not to say that the repetition of drills and grammar exercises is a bad thing, but it's a question really of how we balance it with other things. So these are kind of two principal models that we can use without any technology at all. And possibly this is an extreme case, but it's just to show that it's possible to have the same kind of format regardless of whether we have the latest technology. However, I assume that perhaps most people have access to some kind of technology. This could be old technology, it isn't necessarily the latest thing. And what I'd like to share with you are some things that we can do in this situation where we can cater for learners who have access to something, but possibly have different levels of access or have different quality of technology that they can use. And I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what does away from the classroom mean? And does it mean at home, or does it mean somewhere else? And we could also ask ourselves, what kind of resources, does the student or the college or the university or whatever the institution is have that could be used as tools for blending or flipping the learning? So can we send students to the library, for example? Do we have computer labs that students can use as research and as resource banks and so on? Does it really matter if in the library the books we have are not necessarily the newest, if we're focusing on the principle of students going away, finding information, sourcing things, coming back and delivering it, and using the classroom space as a space to solve problems, to collaborate on new ideas, having used resources outside the library? And as a quick devil's advocate, does it really matter that all the source material is necessarily in English? If the production has to be in English and people consult works in Spanish, then is that not actually adding a skill of being able to shift information from one language to the other? Now, if there are computer labs or computers, not even a computer lab, if there's one or two computers that students can use, then could that be beneficial? As an anecdote, I did some work in a primary school about, I suppose, nearly 40 years ago now, and computers were very new. And I think the primary school had two. And these were very, very old, or what would be seen as slow computers. But they were a godsend, because people basically went to these and found information from them, because the teachers had uploaded a whole range of packages into the computers that the students could use in sort of research and project-based activities in the classroom. So, of course, teachers would have to prepare things. I mean, if the computers aren't connected to the internet, then we can create worksheets, packages, and put them in the computer for the students to use. And of course, this is time-consuming. Of course it is. But is that not exactly what teachers are doing in flipped classrooms, where I'm asking teachers to make video lessons? And this is a challenge for teachers who are not used to doing this in the first place. So the notion that teachers' preparation is different, or teachers' preparation is more or less, I think is not the case. I think we're doing precisely the same thing. We're just doing it with different media. Then let's get on to smartphones, or not even so smartphones. So sometimes people call these dumb phones. So if your students have these, then why can't you upload pictures or flashcards as task stimuli for them, so they could use pictures for a sequencing activity? They could use flashcards for description, for vocabulary memory, all those kinds of things that we could upload into people's smartphones and have them use them. We could send exercises and messages on WhatsApp. So you can send mini messages for activities and exercises to do. You may be aware, I'm sure you are, that there are quite a number of learn by phone packages for people who are quite busy, and they receive 5 or 6 sentences a day to complete, or something like that. So you could do this as a way of being sort of, I suppose, more revolutionary in the way you give homework, by messaging your homework to your students. But also we could use these things as brainstorm instructions, as lead-in instructions, those kinds of things, sort of small messages. And we could encourage students to, let's say, pool their ideas across each other through messaging as well. They could even try this in English and practice messaging in English. So WhatsApp could be used, or messaging could be used as an instruction tool, as a stimulus tool. It could also be used as an audio tool, given that we can now record audio messages on these phones. This means that you can actually turn in listening activities by simply messaging your students or leaving voice messages. In some situations, you could even upload audio files if you're able to do this. Now, of course, data can be expensive, and I understand that in Cuba data is expensive. So it would be wrong to expect your students to use their own data allowance if they have one. But we can get around that as well, because if in your institutions you've got Wi-Fi, if there is, then we can upload everything and upload packages into students' phones, if that's what they have, and do this while the students are in the university where there is contact to Wi-Fi, if that is something that you have. So there won't be online learning as such, but by creating this, they're doing the work through technology outside. So they're also getting used to doing that as well, as a way of sort of exchanging information and managing information. So that would be the side where the teacher, if you like, uses the resource to create, uses the technological resource to create the information packages, the instructions and so on that the students can use away from home. But you could turn it around the other way and have the students produce. So this is a BBC Council, British Council kind of worksheet. But you could give students a worksheet like this. So just like we can upload things onto phones, so can the students. And they could look at this worksheet and prepare a recording of the correctly sequenced conversation. So they get together with perhaps a partner or colleague outside the classroom, and they record their version of the correct dialogue. So students put this in the right order at home. They then record their version in pairs on their phones, and they play the versions in class and compare and see if they've all got the same thing. Now, the benefit of this is that it can create rehearsal time, because one, they can try 2 or 3 ways out and see whether it's the right one. They can practice their intonation, or they can practice their recording of this. So they may not like the first version they say, so they might record it a second time. So there'll be some kind of rehearsal going on. It can also help with people who are more timid about, let's say, performing these things in class, because the traditional thing would be for perhaps 2 students to act this out in the classroom. Now, if students are not happy doing that, but you give them the facility of recording themselves, so they're not being exposed in the moment, they're simply presenting something that they've recorded, then perhaps this will be better for them, because they're not sort of singled out in front of groups. And if people haven't got smartphones to record, but they've got other recording devices that you can play back in the classroom, you can do this as a kind of a flipped way of people doing their practice work and presenting their practice work. But for it to be truly flipped, you need to have some kind of activity that is a collaborative activity afterwards that is based on this. So, for example, once they agree on the correct version in their groups, once they've compared things, they could then produce a brochure or a leaflet. So you're doing an information transfer, and you're using the information, you're using their success at sequencing this conversation to move on and produce something new. So, once again, if we go back to the flipped maxim of understanding, we can say that understanding and practice has taken place outside the classroom, results are checked inside the classroom, and the output is applied to a new collaborative task. There was a question about assessment and how to assess in a flipped environment, and I think this raises a number of issues about the nature of assessment and the kind of assessment that we're engaged in. So, but to start off with, if we think about the activities that the flipped model asks us to foreground in our classroom, they're these, aren't they? We talk about problem-solving activities, information gap sharing activities, information transfer activities, collaborative production activities. So lots of group work, lots of discussion, lots of interaction, lots of creation and analysis, all the high-level skills. And if that's what's going on in the classroom and all our students are doing this, what is the teacher doing during that time? Well, the teacher's going around and monitoring the groups. They're seeing whether the content has been understood. They're seeing if they understood each other. They're seeing if whether the students understood each other, and they're seeing if the collaboration is working, and they'll note down the kinds of language that they're using. So in a way, we could argue that, in fact, formative assessment is continually happening in a flipped environment. It's an ongoing thing, because the more time there is for these collaborative activities, and let's say 70% of the class time is this kind of activity, then there's more time for monitoring, and there's more time, if you like, for teachers to focus in on precisely what individual students are doing. So perhaps we could even argue that the teacher gets a more accurate picture of what a student can actually do than they might get from a sporadic set of tests that happen 1 month in, halfway through the course, at the end of the course. However, when we come to summative testing, we need to think about what it is we want to test and how to measure it, and then how does that relate to the flipped environment. So if we're going to make a quick comparison between the two, we could say the following, and this is very general, but we could say that often in a traditional situation, testing can be knowledge-based, or there's a knowledge-based element to this. Not exclusively, but it does measure the kinds of things that we know. It also measures, when we look at performance, it's kind of controlled performance. If we think about the kinds of speaking tests that we encourage our students to do, such as, let's say, describe a picture, or have a functional role play about I don't know, buying things, then the performance is quite limited and quite controlled. If we look at the listening tests, for example, there'll be a certain kind of number of input texts, and there'll be a certain kind of set of questions that we're asking students to respond to. There are discrete marking criteria. By that I mean that they're quite detailed. We look at the different competences we want to measure. We look at the levels that are needed to pass a certain exam, those kinds of things. And these are often set out in a quite detailed way. And there's a clear division very often into the 4 skills. And sometimes 2 of the skills are mixed. We might have reading and writing together. But the notion of 4 skills, or the paradigm of 4 skills, is absolutely paramount in more traditional language testing. And we have separate tests for these. In the flipped context, this is slightly different. We could argue that in a flipped situation, things are more task-based. So, given that they're more task-based, this means that other features would could form part of the assessment, because the focus would be possibly more on the successful outcome. Was it achieved? Did they do what they were supposed to do? Marking criteria could then become more flexible, because part of them would be on whether it was achieved, whether the tasks were achieved. And so we're looking at a profile rather than a threshold, because it's possible to achieve a task quite successfully using various ranges of language. So an A2 speaker could achieve the same task as a B1 speaker, or even a B2 user of the language, but they've used a different set of language to achieve it. So we'd be able to profile people. Well, this person is using A2 language to achieve this, but they've read a B1 text, but they've used A2 language to manage the task itself. So we could argue various things around that. So the skills in doing tasks are likely to be integrated. So there's a continuum of communication going on. People might read something, speak something, write something, all as part of one task. And in a way, you could argue that this reflects more what happens in real life, because it's unlikely in real life that we are only listening to something and then responding to a series of discrete questions, or we're only asked to talk about something in response to stimulus material that isn't necessarily what we would normally look at. So we could argue, if you like, that the flipped situation might help us produce more real-life situations, but contained within that are assumptions that are made about receptive skills, sometimes through the performance that is done in the tasks. So we're not necessarily discretely measuring somebody's reading comprehension. We're assuming that because they're able to use the information they've read to do something else, that they've understood what they've read. If I can give you an example of this, here's a meeting negotiation, could be a typical example. We could set up a meeting negotiation, and let's say it's a meeting for 4 people. And let's say each person coming to the meeting has a different role with differing objectives. So they each receive the stimulus material that's attached to their role. They're given time to make notes about what is on the stimulus material, and then the stimulus would contain probably some general information about the scenario and some specific confidential information that is only appropriate for their role. And then in the examination themselves, when it actually takes place, they can't bring their stimulus material to the exam. They can only bring the notes they've taken. So they have to have been able to understand things, and they can't either copy out verbatim what they have read, because that would defeat the object. And then they come together in a meeting and they're given time to achieve a resolution. And at that point, you could argue, well, you could ask what is the examiner supposed to be doing? Well, there might be an examiner in the corner of the room, or the meeting might be filmed if you have the technology to do this, or it could be audio recorded, though probably it would be better to actually be physically present or be able to watch what goes on in some shape or form. And after that, once the meeting is finished, you could then do this and have a more personalized phase of each person who came to the meeting to write a brief report email to their boss or to their employer about the outcome of the meeting. So you've got a continuum of a series of events. You've got a reading, or probably a reading, to a speaking, to which would involve some kind of listening in order for the meeting to have taken place successfully, and then some production through writing. So you're covering the 4 skills within this. So then when we look at the criteria that you might need to assess this, we probably consider the task completion. Did they do what they were supposed to? How did each person participate? Was it sufficiently equal? Not was it absolutely equal, but was it sufficiently equal? And how did they behave? What was their demeanor? Were they encouraging, and so on? So we might look at that as well. We might look at the turn taking. So did people engage in short turn taking, long turn taking? Did that change? Were the different people dominant at certain points? We might look at turn management. So were there interruptions? Were they achieved successfully? Did people ask for clarification? Did people give the floor, if you like, to each other? And was that managed successfully, and how was that achieved? We might also look at how much detail did they relay from the stimulus material. So at that point, we're then looking at how much they understood. And then we might look at the language level, the accuracy, the fluency, the range of expression, the kind of typical things that you might want to measure in a more traditional language test scenario. And to do that, we then might also look at their understanding of their colleagues, because that would help with their responses, their turn taking, and so on. So that would also be, if you like, an impression about their ability to understand what has been said. And we can map the language, fluency, accuracy, and so on against CFR statements or others to ascertain what the student can do in terms of language level. So bringing that all together, we could say that actually, yes, there is a range of elements that we can extract from one simulation, rather than necessarily have separate tests in reading and writing and speaking and listening. And we could say that by doing this, we're probably reflecting what learners are already doing in their flipped classrooms. So we're asking them to do one more thing that looks very similar to what they've already been doing throughout their learning career, if you like, if we are adopting a flipped classroom program. And by doing that, we're not having to train them to do specific things for specific exam situations, which are not what they would normally do in the rest of their lives. They're not being trained to use techniques that are perhaps redundant once they leave an examination or formal examination-based environment. We could also argue that these are the things that possibly reflect real-life communication more than what happens in exam rooms. Lastly, there was a question about how ESP can be implemented in a flipped environment. The answer, I think, is quite easily, and I hope that some of the scenarios that I've used up to now have related to those of you who are engaged in ESP teaching. And essentially, like all ESP, the processes are the same, but it's the subject matter and the contexts and the language that we use that will change. So in simple terms, all you would need to do is to modify the instructional content that you have to suit the particular specific purpose that you're training. You'd modify or you create the stimulus material that suits that. So do we have business-based, medical-based, engineering-based, that kind of thing. But the most important thing around this, I think, is creating tasks that are relevant. And relevant to two things. Relevant to the subject area. So if you are teaching concepts as well as language, I think one of the problems with ESP is that sometimes we're not sure whether we're teaching new concepts to people or whether we're teaching people the language to use within their own profession and they already understand all the concepts. I think this has always been a challenge of perhaps English for specific study purposes or English for specific occupational purposes, if you like. And so relevant to the profession. And I'd like to share an example with you around this. This is one that comes from the time when I used to work in Siemens, an engineering company in Germany, and I had a job working with power station engineers. And this is an adaptation of a particular activity that I did with them. Again, this is task-based, and the task this time was to agree on citing a pipeline. So it happened that the process and the model was very similar to the model that we looked at for the meeting examination scenario. The task was to agree the best route for a pipeline through a country, I think. It might have been through a region, I forget. And it followed this same principle. So everyone shared materials that were about the general scenario descriptions, geographical considerations, political background of the country or region concerned, maps. All these things were pre-produced and the country or region was fictitious. And then we had 3 groups, and the groups were given separate instructions about their particular route. And their role in the groups was to think of how they could prepare a mini presentation to the larger group about their particular route and the pros and cons of that particular route. So they had to sort of put forward what was advantageous, what was not advantageous about that. Not necessarily to advocate it, but just simply to make an analysis of it. Once the general meeting happened, each of the groups presented their analysis of their particular pipeline route, and then everybody had to come together and decide which was the best one. And having decided on the best one, they then had to make a formal presentation to a fictitious imaginary government official. Now, the point about this scenario is that there was no need for any input from me on engineering or from the materials about engineering, because the students were already engineers, so they brought that understanding with them from their work. The background reading that they did was done away from the classroom, and so that the classroom discussion capitalized on their understanding of 2 things. It capitalized on their understanding of the task-specific information and on their professional expertise and their understanding of the general difficulties that are incurred in citing pipelines, the engineering considerations that need to be taken into account. And my role during all of this was to monitor what went on, give feedback on the use of language, and to talk about different strategies they could use either in the presentation or in the way they interacted with each other. These were B1 users of English, so these were not people whose English was vastly fluent, but they were highly competent engineers. So were they able to achieve this? Absolutely. Were they able to achieve this in masterful English? No, because these were B1 users of the language. But the whole point of this was that they were able to discover new things, if you like, or pool and analyze information, and then bring that to a classroom situation where they would apply it and discuss it and use their language to help them. So I hope this has given you some ideas, and I hope it's shown that the principles of the flipped classroom and blended learning are not so new, that they had their basis in task-based and project-based learning, and this has been going on certainly since the 1980s. But perhaps the difference is speed of access and breadth of resources. And perhaps the idea that input and instruction could happen away from the classroom and not in the classroom has been amplified by the fact that the teacher can now appear via a screen, so we can see our teachers somewhere else. But even without this, I feel that the teacher has always been present. They've been present in the materials they've created. They've been present in the way they've inspired their students to learn both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to talking to you in the WhatsApp chat tomorrow.